At dawn, Rome still smelled of iron and blood. The first light slipped through the arches of the Colosseum, illuminating the remains of a macabre banquet that had ended just hours before. The dark stains on the sand were not shadows, but the traces of lives erased by the crowd. Vendors shouted in the aisles, offering watered-down wine and olives while slaves dragged away the unclaimed bodies. The city was waking up, but the monster had never slept. Beneath the stands, roars echoed like omens. Lions with prominent ribs, chained elephants, panthers throwing themselves against the bars. The keepers whipped them to keep them fierce. In the tunnels, gladiators sharpened their swords, not as a sign of practice, but of resignation. Every edge gleamed like a promise. One of them would not see nightfall. Above all this chaos, a murmur grew until it became a roar. Thousands of Romans arrived with the same desire, to witness death turned into a spectacle. Rome had perfected the art of killing. It had transformed it into a liturgy, into political pedagogy, into a collective addiction. The Colosseum was not just a stadium, it was a temple of social control. There, the people learned to applaud violence, to admire the power that could decide who lived and who died. In every combat, the hierarchy of the empire was reproduced. The victor represented authority, the defeated represented obedience. Every blow was a lesson in bloody politics. The authorities knew this well. Admission to the amphitheater was free, bread was distributed before the show, and the chants of the crowd were rehearsed like national anthems. It was not just about entertainment, it was a choreography of loyalty. The Roman citizen felt like part of the power when shouting the name of their favorite gladiator, when laughing at seeing the enemy fall. Their fear dissolved in the masses, their guilt in the noise. The Colosseum, with its 70,000 roaring souls, was a gigantic emotional machine. It turned horror into habit and habit into pride. The blood of others offered a catharsis that kept the poor calm and the powerful secure. In the minds of the people, the suffering of others was justified as a natural destiny. It was the price of glory, the sacrifice that sustained civilization. From above, the emperors watched. There was no compassion on their faces, only calculation. They knew that fear is more effective than love, and that nothing unites the people more than a shared death. Rome ruled not only with legions, but with emotions. The arena was the laboratory where collective feelings were manufactured, where pity was slowly extinguished under the applause. Some chroniclers would later speak of the Colosseum as a symbol of architectural greatness. But beneath that perfect stone lay a psychological experiment, to accustom men to look at pain without looking away, to teach them to confuse justice with punishment, amusement with crime. It was a lesson that would remain alive centuries later, disguised on screens, televised wars, and sports competitions where humiliation is applauded. Perhaps that is why, when the sun rose over the amphitheater, Rome did not just wake up to watch people die. It woke up to remember who was in charge. The roar of the people was the music of power, and every drop of blood, a hymn to the order that kept the empire standing. The origin of the games was not born in greatness, but in death. It was the year 264 BC when the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva decided to honor their father not with statues or prayers, but with a tribute of blood. In a cattle market, amidst the stench of manure and smoke, 3 pairs of slaves were forced to fight until only bodies remained. It was not entertainment, it was a munus, a sacred duty to the dead. Blood had to accompany the soul on its journey, as if the spirit could not rest without one last victim. This rite, born of Campanian and Samnite customs, transformed mourning into a contract with the afterlife. The death of one appeased the restlessness of the other. However, Rome never did anything without turning it into an instrument of power. What began as a gesture of piety became a political rehearsal. Soon the funerals of the rich became public spectacles, where family honor was measured in liters of spilled blood. Burying a man with gold demonstrated wealth. Burying him with corpses demonstrated dominance. The people watched, they applauded, and something ignited in the hearts of the rulers. They understood that blood could serve for more than calming the gods. It could feed obedience. Funerary games became part of religious festivals, offered to Jupiter, to Mars, to the divine order itself. Senators justified them as acts of faith, But in reality, they were propaganda rehearsals. Every combat reinforced the narrative of power. Rome conquered even death. Gladiators were not just men who fought, they were living symbols. Their armor told stories. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved sword, the Gaul with his broad blade. Seeing them fall, the public relived the victories of the empire. It was a theater of propaganda where the arena replaced the battlefield. The defeat of the enemy was repeated day after day until it was etched into the collective unconscious as a dogma. Rome could not be defeated. But beyond politics, there was something darker. The spectator's pleasure in the suffering of others. The philosophers of the time knew it. The Stoic Seneca wrote that whoever gets used to seeing death slowly loses their humanity. And yet the empire needed that moral anesthesia. A sensitive people cannot be ruled by fear. A hardened people can. Behind every sacrifice was an invisible calculation. Ritual violence united the divine with the political. The gods received blood, the rulers received loyalty. The echo of the combat did not fade with the last scream. It became a permanent reminder of who had the power to decide who should live and who should serve as a lesson. Over time, the games became institutionalized. Wooden bleachers were built, then stone. Religion gave way to the state. The monus was no longer a duty to the dead, but a spectacle for the living. Rome had discovered a formula that centuries of tyrannies would repeat: distract to dominate. Give the people something to love or something to hate so they do not look toward the throne. In those bloody funerals, something more than a tradition was born. The idea was born that pain can have a political function, that killing can be a way of teaching obedience, that fear, well administered, is worth more than justice. And so, death ceased to be an end to become an instrument. That day in the market of the Forum, no one knew it. But Rome had just invented its most enduring religion, faith in violence as the order of the world. The roar of the beast preceded that of the crowd. From Africa, Asia, and the northern lands arrived live cargo that turned the Colosseum into a zoo of the condemned. Lions from Cyrenaica, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, bears from Germania, tigers from Persia, and even giraffes crossed seas and deserts to die before a public that applauded their extinction. Rome called them venationes, hunts. But it was not hunting, it was an execution of nature in the name of human dominance. Julius Caesar was the first to understand the symbolic potential of that cruelty. In 46 BC, he paraded a never-before-seen creature through the streets of Rome, a giraffe. The Romans baptized it Camelopardalis, half camel, half leopard, because their language knew no word for such a rarity. But the amazement was short-lived. The beast was thrown into the amphitheater and torn to pieces before thousands of ecstatic eyes. It was not about admiring the exotic, but about demonstrating that Rome could subjugate even the unknown. Decades later, when the Colosseum opened its doors under Emperor Titus, the lesson was repeated on a monstrous scale. During the inauguration, more than 9,000 animals were slaughtered in a single festival. Archaeologists still find bones with marks of deliberate starvation, proof that the beasts were weakened to ensure a quick, clean, and spectacular massacre. Even elephants, ancient symbols of Carthaginian power, were forced to die in the arena that had once trembled beneath their steps in Hannibal's war. But the real spectacle occurred before the combats. The logistics of death were in themselves a work of imperial engineering. Hunters in Libya, Nubia, or Syria captured wild animals with traps that cost dozens of human lives. Caravans dragged cages across the Sahara. Ships loaded them on the Nile. Slaves unloaded them in Ostia. Every creature that survived the crossing was a victory of Roman will over nature. The journey could last months, and many animals arrived mutilated, sick, or driven mad. But that only made the spectacle safer. A weak beast bleeds better. Seeing a lion die in the arena was not just an act of violence, it was a declaration of power. Every muffled roar was an affirmation. Rome rules the world. The emperors knew that the crowd needed symbols of greatness. The venationes were their gospel. In them, a brutal doctrine was preached, that the entire universe had been created to be conquered, hunted, and consumed by the Roman man. Some emperors transformed these hunts into personal stages of vanity. Commodus, disguised as Hercules, descended into the ring to pierce animals with poisoned arrows. His bow killed chained tigers, already wounded bears, ostriches with their legs cut off. The public cheered him, not out of admiration, but out of fear. Not applauding meant treason. The farce of the divine hero concealed the truth of a despot sick with narcissism. Behind the applause, intellectuals began to understand the price of so much blood. Pliny the Elder warned that lion and leopard populations were disappearing from their native lands. Rome, in its thirst for spectacle, was extinguishing the creatures that made its greatness possible. The arena of the Colosseum was not only a cemetery of men, but also of entire ecosystems. And yet for the empire, the loss of nature was not a tragedy. It was a triumph. Every animal corpse was an offering to progress, proof that even wild chaos could be domesticated. In the Roman mind, order was built upon destruction. Where life once roared, the crowd now roared. When the dust settled and the smell of burning flesh rose under the sun, Rome did not see the death of a lion. It saw the confirmation of its own eternity. But in reality, that final roar did not announce glory, but the slow agony of a world that was beginning to lose its soul under the weight of applause. When one imagines a gladiator fight, one usually thinks of two equal warriors, facing each other with honor under the gaze of the empire. But the truth was much more perverse. Rome did not seek justice or balance. It sought a spectacle. Every rule, every weapon, every pairing was calculated to produce tension, surprise, and above all, blood. The Colosseum was not a battlefield. It was a laboratory of pain. In the arena, roles were as rigid as the hierarchies of Roman society. The retiarius, armed with a net and a trident, had to face the secutor, covered by smooth armor and a helmet with no openings. The former relied on agility, the latter on weight and endurance. It was a duel designed for uncertainty. If the retiarius managed to trap with the net, the crowd roared. If he failed, the secutor's sword split him in two. Rome called that suspense. But most of those who entered the arena were not trained gladiators. They were prisoners, slaves, condemned criminals. Many were given wooden, edgeless weapons, while their opponents wielded real steel. The combat became a disguised execution. Chroniclers describe it coldly. The people laughed while the man without a sword sought to flee. Death was the most applauded joke of the day. Even the armor was a form of torture. Some helmets reduced vision to a minimal slit. Others suffocated breathing. The weight of the metals was so great that many fell before receiving the first blow. It was not about protecting them, but about prolonging their agony. Every stumble, every gasp, every fall was part of the invisible script that kept the crowd hypnotized. In the first century, the rules of horror expanded. The gladiatrices appeared, women condemned to fight for the amusement of the public. Dressed in armor that barely covered their bodies, they were exhibited as trophies before the combat. They fought against dwarves, against animals, or among themselves, while spectators shouted obscenities and bets. Rome turned even the female body into conquered territory. The gladiatrices not only defied their destiny, but also the very concept of humanity within the empire. The spectacle of imbalance served a deeper purpose, to reaffirm that Rome had the right to decide who deserved to win. Chance did not exist. Victory was an imperial concession. Thus, the public learned that justice depended on power, not on virtue. Every combat was a living metaphor for the system. A few in full armor, thousands naked before authority. Sometimes, to maintain the crowd's attention, organizers mixed rules and weapons. Gladiators with incompatible styles faced off, or entire groups fought as if they were miniature armies. On those days, the arena became a swamp of blood and viscera. Bodies piled up, weapons broke, and the slaves in charge of cleaning the arena had to cover the puddles with a new layer of dust before the next act. The Romans said that the arena purified, that the gladiators' courage washed away the sins of the people. But in reality, what purified was fear, the relief of knowing that one was not down there oneself. The applause was inverted prayers, pleas disguised as jubilation. Every time the crowd shouted, "Kill him!" what they were really saying was, "Don't choose me." The violence of the Colosseum was not limited to the body. It penetrated the mind. It turned the spectator into an accomplice, the executioner into an idol, the victim into oblivion. In that circle of stone, Rome trained its people to love punishment and despise compassion. It was a spectacle of domination, where blood taught obedience and laughter covered the horror. Thus, as the sun set over the arena and the metallic smell mixed with cheap wine, the empire continued writing its pedagogy of control, a perfect system where even death had a director, a script, and applause. When the sun reached its highest point, the shadows disappeared and the sand became a mirror of fire. It was the most anticipated and most feared hour. Noon. The gladiator fights were interrupted, and the public, excited and fatigued, demanded a change of tone. Then began the damnatio ad bestias, the condemnations to the beasts. What followed was no longer a fight, but an execution disguised as myth. The condemned were called noxii, the harmful ones. Criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war. But many of them were guilty only of having opposed the wrong power. They were thrown into the center of the arena in ragged tunics, their hands tied, while laughter could be heard from the stands. There was no trial, no defense, only a script, to die in a way that entertained the people. Every execution was a public lesson. Arsonists were burned alive. Thieves were thrown to the wolves. Traitors were given to the lions. The punishment had to imitate the crime so that the message was clear. Rome punished with imagination. The beasts were kept hungry for days. When the iron doors opened, the crowd stood up. The roar of the beasts mixed with that of the public, and for an instant, the line between animal and human disappeared. Chroniclers recount that during the celebrations of Emperor Trajan, after his victory over the Dacians, more than 11,000 prisoners were executed in 103 days of uninterrupted spectacle. It was not chaos, it was choreography. Cruelty had rhythm, structure, purpose. Each day had to surpass the previous one, and the spectators arrived knowing they would witness something new. Death, to maintain its value, had to reinvent itself. In the arena, bodies became parables. The condemned embodied mythical heroes. Orpheus devoured by wild animals, Prometheus chained while birds tore out his liver, Icarus thrown from an improvised platform to be torn apart upon falling. The public did not see people, they saw characters. In Rome, in its delirium, transformed justice into a farce, pity into a spectacle. Sometimes fire joined the performance. Prisoners were forced to wear the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch that ignited upon contact with a torch. The flames climbed up their bodies while vendors offered wine and children applauded. The philosopher Tertullian would later call them human torches, a symbol of the Roman soul ignited by sadism. From the boxes, senators and priests watched without flinching. That was not cruelty, they said. It was pedagogy. The people had to see to learn, see the guilty die to believe in order, and they learned it well. The masses, hardened by years of blood, began to measure morality by the intensity of the punishment. The slower the death, the more just the system seemed. But not everyone remained silent. Seneca wrote in horror that the noon executions turned the soul to stone. Whoever gets used to seeing suffering ceases to know how to pity. His words, however, were lost amidst the applause. Rome did not want philosophers, it wanted noise. The damnatio ad bestias not only punished bodies, it taught obedience. Every roar, every scream, reminded the spectator that their safety depended on not crossing the invisible line that separated the public from the condemned. That border, invisible but omnipresent, held the empire together. Those who were above could applaud. Those below had to die. Noon thus became a black mass of power. Bread was not offered but flesh. Prayers were not raised but screams. And in that liturgy of fire and blood, Rome reaffirmed itself as the goddess and executioner of itself. As Rome became obsessed with the magnitude of the spectacle, the emperors began to compete not only in cruelty, but in scale. The arena was no longer enough. They wanted oceans in the heart of the city, artificial storms, controlled fires, corpses floating like defeated fleets. Thus were born the naumachii, naval battles where water replaced sand and death learned to swim. Julius Caesar was the first to conceive this madness. In 46 BC, he had a massive basin excavated near the Tiber, filled it with water, and ordered a mock war between Egyptian and Tyrian fleets. Thousands of prisoners were forced to board and fight to the last man. Archers fired from the shores, catapults launched fire, and ships crashed into each other in a bloody ballet. It was not military training, it was imperial theater. Caesar wanted to prove that he could create seas where none existed, that even the untamable element, water, obeyed Rome. Decades later, Augustus surpassed his predecessor. In 2 BC, he built an artificial lake of absurd dimensions, almost 600 meters long, fed by its own aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina. 30 warships and thousands of condemned men clashed in a deadly choreography. From the stands, the people watched as men sank under the weight of their armor, while oars dyed the water red. The emperor smiled. The sea itself served the empire. But the delirium reached its peak under Claudius, who ordered an entire natural lake, Lake Fucine, emptied to stage another Naumachia. Slaves worked for years on canals and locks. On opening day, the prisoners greeted the emperor with a phrase that would resonate for centuries. Ave, Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. Those words, a mix of resignation and terror, condensed the essence of Rome. Life offered as a spectacle to maintain order. Water was a mirror in which power contemplated itself, but fire, on the other hand, was its tool of purification. In the Colosseum, executions with the tunica molesta multiplied. Bodies burned like human torches while musicians played lyres and flutes to keep time with the screams. Some prisoners were dressed as mythological heroes. Hercules dying, consumed by the poison of the shirt of Nessus. Mucius Scaevola burning his hand as proof of loyalty. The difference was that in the myth, there was redemption. In the arena, only ashes remained. Fire and water, the two most powerful elements of nature, thus became instruments of domination. Rome was no longer satisfied with ruling men. It wanted to rule the elements, to prove that nothing escaped its control. Engineers and architects designed mechanisms that allowed the Colosseum to be flooded and drained in a matter of hours. Trapdoors released torrents of water to stage small naval battles in the morning, and by late afternoon, the arena was dried to host new executions. Death, like everything in the empire, followed a precise schedule. Roman engineering was admirable, yes, but it was also the coalface of institutionalized sadism, building to destroy, innovating to torture, perfecting the technique of the spectacle until the boundary between art and horror was erased. Every time an artificial wave covered the sand, or a flame licked the skin of a condemned man, Rome reaffirmed its faith in violence as proof of superiority. The ancient gods who had once demanded sacrifices now seemed replaced by the emperors themselves. They decided who burned and who floated, who should sink, who should shine. In that dominion over fire and water, Rome believed it touched eternity, but what it was really building was a machine that devoured its own soul. Over time, the boundary between religion and spectacle disappeared. Rome, obsessed with absolute control, found a new way to demonstrate its power: rewriting myths. Those stories that once gave meaning to the human soul, legends of love, sacrifice, and redemption, were transformed into bloody satires. The Colosseum became a stage where heroes were humiliated, gods ridiculed, and the most sacred symbols turned into parody. At one of the amphitheater's inaugurations, an actor was forced to play Orpheus, the musician who, according to legend, calmed wild beasts with his lyre. But Rome did not believe in miracles. It believed in the spectacle. As the man played, guards opened a trap door and released a starving bear. Instead of enchanted beasts, the artist was torn to pieces before thousands of spectators. The audience applauded the irony. What in the myth represented harmony between man and nature, Rome turned into a mockery of beauty and a triumph of the most brutal instinct. Another prisoner, dressed as Daedalus, the inventor who dreamed of flying, was tied to a wooden frame with wax wings. A mechanism lifted him briefly above the arena before he plummeted to the ground, falling into the claws of the beasts. "He must have wished for real feathers," wrote the poet Martial with a sarcasm that hid horror. Rome laughed even at the human aspiration to escape its own prison. And then there was the most grotesque myth, that of Pasiphae, the queen condemned to fall in love with a bull. In the Colosseum, her story was recreated with a wooden machine and a condemned woman forced to perform the act, followed by her public execution. The spectacle bordered on pornography, a hybrid of humiliation and punishment. Rome, the cradle of law, had invented institutional obscenity. Every performance had a hidden message. The gods were no longer sacred, the empire was. If Rome could manipulate its myths, it could manipulate the minds of its people. By ridiculing heroes, it eliminated any model of virtue that could rival imperial power. No one was to dream of escaping, flying, singing, or loving outside the state's script. Later philosophers would see in these scenes a form of political sacrilege. Myths were not just ancient tales. They were the collective memory of a civilization. To destroy them was to erase the moral roots of the people. Rome did not just murder bodies, it murdered meanings. It transformed stories that gave hope into warnings, heroic deeds into lessons in obedience. Art itself became an accomplice. Sculptors carved scenes of violence with exquisite precision. Poets, fearful, sang the glories of Caesar, disguising their repulsion with metaphors. The empire had understood something that modern tyrants would also learn. Controlling the narrative is more effective than controlling the sword. In that amphitheater of marble and blood, myths ceased to be a refuge and became cages. Heroes rewritten as victims. Goddesses reduced to objects. Monsters turned into pets of the spectacle. Each new performance was a denial of humanity under the guise of art. Rome, which believed itself eternal, began to rot precisely because of its theatrical genius. It had forgotten that greatness cannot be sustained on the humiliation of the sacred. And as the echoes of laughter faded within the walls of the Colosseum, something deeper died with them. Man's faith in the meaning of his own stories. When myths were no longer enough to satisfy the public, the emperors decided to take the center of the arena. The line separating the god from the actor, the ruler from the executioner, vanished. All of Rome became a stage, and its fate depended on the vanity of those who believed themselves immortal. Caligula was the first to transform his madness into a spectacle. He believed that blood reaffirmed his divinity. When the animals ran out, he ordered spectators to be dragged from the stands and thrown into the pit. "They came to see death, and they shall have it," he said with a laugh. The terrified people kept applauding. They did not applaud out of pleasure, but out of fear. Rome had created a power that demanded worship even in the midst of cruelty. Nero, his heir in dementia, took theatricality to another level. He considered himself an artist, actor, poet, and musician, all at once. He ordered prisoners executed while performing Greek tragedies, forcing them to die exactly like the characters in the plays. For him, the pain of others was stage material. Rome watched him, torn between horror and fascination. No one could stop him, because the tyrant who turns death into art seeks not only obedience, but admiration. Domitian perfected paranoia as a form of government. His nighttime spectacles, lit by torches, kept Rome awake with the uncertainty of whether the entertainment would turn into punishment. In the dark, the crowd understood that power could strike at any moment, without warning or reason. It was a reminder that fear was the only constant in the empire. Then came Commodus, the emperor who wanted to be Hercules reincarnated. He appeared in the Colosseum dressed in a lion skin, armed with a bow and club, and boasted of killing hundreds of animals that had been tamed or previously wounded to ensure his triumph. On one occasion, he decapitated ostriches and showed their heads to the audience, laughing while the Senate feigned enthusiasm. It was a divine pantomime, the false god who needed to kill to feel real. Commodus's madness was not limited to the circus. He demanded that gladiators let him win, and those who did not were executed. He had an altar built in the Colosseum to worship himself, and in his delirium changed the name of Rome to Colonia Commodiana. The amphitheater no longer belonged to the people, nor to the gods. It belonged to the ego. But even the longest applause has an end. He was strangled by his own guards, victims of the same obedience he had cultivated. Even the good emperors succumbed to the vertigo of the spectacle. Trajan, considered just and wise, celebrated his victory over the Dacians with 103 days of games. Thousands of men and animals were sacrificed in his honor. Blood flowed not out of cruelty, but out of custom. Rome had reached the point where greatness was measured in corpses. The Colosseum became a mirror of the imperial soul. The vaster the glory, the deeper the rot. Absolute power had mutated into an addiction to applause. Emperors no longer sought to govern, they sought to be loved, feared, and acclaimed all at once. Each spectacle was a dose of euphoria that soon demanded another, more brutal one. The chroniclers of the time understood this with bitter clarity. "The gods watch and remain silent," wrote Tacitus, "because Rome has become its own punishment." The emperors, devoured by the need to be seen, failed to notice that the very people who shouted their names would be the ones to celebrate their fall. Thus, while the empire shone beneath the fireworks of death, its structure cracked from within. The screams of the gladiators blended with those of the Senate, the applause with the pleas. Rome had become a gilded cage where power could only survive if it kept killing. Over time, the echoes of the Colosseum began to fade. The stands, once filled with 60 or 70,000 roaring throats, began to empty. Not because Rome became compassionate, but because exhaustion and ruin infiltrated every stone. The emperors had squandered fortunes on blood, and blood was no longer enough to sustain the myth of eternity. The machinery of the spectacle, which had once served to govern, became a dead weight dragging the empire toward its own grave. But before the silence there were those who dared to speak. Seneca, a witness to the moral decline, warned that watching death without flinching was a sign of the soul's corruption. "Man," he wrote, "does not harden himself to be strong, but to forget that he too can suffer." His voice, however, was a whisper against the roar of the masses. The philosopher knew that the Colosseum did not just murder bodies, it murdered empathy. Cicero, decades earlier, had already sensed the same danger. To him, Roman courage was transforming into gratuitous cruelty. But he admitted a paradox. The people demanded the games, and to deny them blood was to lose their loyalty. Rome had created a monster it had to feed constantly. The politics of entertainment became a state addiction. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, a formula as simple as it was fatal. Early Christians would see in these spectacles proof of the empire's diseased soul. Tertullian, horrified, called them seeds of cruelty. To them, the amphitheater was not a place of glory, but an altar of demons. The martyrs, thrown to the lions, transformed their suffering into a testament. As the beast tore at their bodies, the audience saw for the first time a different form of resistance, dying without hate, without applause, with faith. That serenity baffled Rome more than any sword. Little by little, Christianity, poverty, and fatigue eroded the thirst for spectacle. The empire, which had spent fortunes building arenas, began to run out of bread and armies. The borders creaked, the legions crumbled, the barbarians advanced. The crowd, accustomed to the state providing entertainment, discovered that there were no longer any condemned men or animals left to kill. The arena dried up, the cages rusted, the roar of the people turned into a murmur. The Colosseum, still majestic, turned into a ruin as the world changed. Centuries covered it in moss. Earthquakes shattered it. Popes consecrated it as a symbol of redemption. Pilgrims walked on the same sand where death had once been celebrated, saying prayers for the souls that fell there. The amphitheater of horror became a temple of repentance. But the message, the true message, outlived its walls. The history of the Colosseum was not just the history of Roman brutality, but an eternal warning about what happens when a society turns pain into a spectacle. Rome believed itself immortal because it had tamed death. It did not understand that whoever trivializes it ends up devoured by it. Today, tourists stroll through its tunnels, admiring the architectural genius. They take photographs, they smile. But if one listens closely, beneath the stones, a murmur can still be heard. It is not the wind. It is the echoes of an audience that applauded cruelty so much that they ended up believing it was a virtue. The Colosseum remains, silent but alive, as a scar on the human soul. Its lesson lies not in its form, but in its purpose. A reminder that no empire can sustain itself on the celebration of suffering. Rome fell not because of the barbarians, but because of the moral void it dug for itself. Because any civilization that glorifies violence, that confuses justice with spectacle, ends up collapsing under the weight of its own applause. And the echo of that collapse, that distant roar that still vibrates in the stones, is the whisper that warns us. What was entertainment yesterday could be condemnation tomorrow.